In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
The journey to Silent Hill has never been an easy one for James, but it is one that he can't help but make in order to face the truth. Silent Hill 2. Regarded as one of the greatest horror games of all time, it had a much more different approach to presenting players with a terrifying experience. While most horror games of the early 2000s were rooted in classic horror tropes like monsters, ghosts, or terrible voice acting,
Wow, what a mansion!
Silent Hill 2 puts a greater emphasis on the psychological and existential scares. James's adventure in Silent Hill is less about simply trying to survive the horrors of the town and more on surviving his own nightmares. A game that is heavily focused on personal struggles and more about the trauma that lives in all of us, Silent Hill 2 is one of the greatest and earliest progenitors in helping establish what makes the psychological horror genre so great. After 23 years and skipping the first game for some reason, Silent Hill 2 finally got the remake treatment, and it was time for a modern-day audience, as well as you old-timey Silent Hill fans out there, to see the retelling of James Sunderland. As for me, having built enough courage to finally play the first Silent Hill game after 25 years, thanks to every modern horror game helping me build up my tolerance, I was able to experience both the classical and remake version of Silent Hill 2. So, how does the original still fare 23 years later, and is the remake worth playing? Well, let's take a look, with a retrospective and modern day review, as well as a comparative one of both the original and remake of Silent Hill 2. The story is arguably the most well-known feature of Silent Hill 2. You play as James Sunderland, who has come to the town of Silent Hill in order to seek answers regarding a mysterious letter that he received from his wife Mary. The catch is that Mary died of an illness 3 years prior, yet was given to him after her death, signed in her name. Despite knowing full well that Mary has passed away, James fully believes in the possibility that his wife may still be alive somewhere in Silent Hill. During his search, he discovers that the town is far from normal, with monsters seemingly inhabiting the place and only a handful of less than normal individuals waiting for James. It's a story shrouded in mystery, and one that slowly unveils itself as James presses on into the depths of Silent Hill, where you start to learn about why he and the others have a connection to the town. Despite being written over 23 years ago, the story of James remains one of the most intriguing and melancholy tales that you'll hear in video games, and not just in the horror genre itself. The struggles he goes through, the characters he meets, the enemies that he has to face, all combine to make the unique story of James worth experiencing, and even re-experiencing in the case of the remake. The story is very much well preserved in the modern adaptation, with virtually no changes to the overall plot points, so for those who want to dive into the updated experience of Silent Hill 2, you're getting the same story that the first game delivered. There's a few nuances that Team Bloober decided to expand upon, like the voicing of James and the other characters,
The name on the envelope said Mary.
as well as some scene inclusions. But as far as my back-to-back experience of the game goes, the remake is a one-to-one retelling of the original. Now, before I talk more about the story, I will be going into spoiler territory, so please skip here if you'd like to avoid it. But at a glance, both the original and remake story are very much worth your time if you'd like to make the revisit to either. Speaking first about James, the star of the show makes for a very interesting character in the game's mystery, due to his personality and rather one-track-minded motivation. He comes off as being very polite when it comes to interacting with the other cast around him, as well as hearing him as the player. In the original, it's a little weird because of the slightly higher-pitched cheeriness in his voice.
But I got a letter from her. She says she was waiting.
Whether or not that's due to the voice acting of the time, or the intended voice direction from the game, he does come off as a little too sane and positive, especially by virtue of everyone else. It's this specific character personality that makes both him and the other cast of characters very intriguing, especially in regards to the larger reveals of Maria, Angela, Eddie, and even Lara, and how they are all drawn to Silent Hill. I could talk more about them and delve deeper into how well their characters shape the story, as well as juxtapose James himself, but I think that would be best for you guys to enjoy. There is essentially a lot of depth when it comes to each of these characters, and there's more work going on than how they seem. This same character intrigue in the cast is very much carried over to the remake, and can be argued is done a little better thanks to the quote-unquote more believable voice cast.
I know how it sounds. I don't.
Hey, it's okay.
Now, I say quote-unquote because you could argue that the stiffness and lack of personality in the older voice acting actually makes those characters sound interestingly weird.
I'm looking for Mary. Have you seen her?
Didn't you say she died?
But you could also argue that the characters in the remake are just way more believable. More on this later in the sound design. That being said, the peculiarities that define each of the characters are very much carried over into the remake. Even with some tonal and expression shifts due to the difference in voice direction and actors, their characters still feel the same in both games. Personally, I like both actually, and I enjoyed the stiff awkwardness of the voice cast in the original, as well as the more emotional deliveries of the remake. Outside of the characters, the setting and monsters are the other important additions to the story's world building and atmosphere. Without giving too much away, the themes and motifs that the monsters represent with regards to James's psyche are all thematically placed throughout his journey. Notable examples include the ever-famous Pyramid Head that acts as both a thematic device and imposing figure, recurs appropriately throughout the game. This also extends to the remake as well, with the monster locations and settings fitting the same thematic bill of James's adventure. The world building and themes of the original are well represented in the remake. I did read that there are 2 new ending additions to the remake as well, which I haven't quite gotten yet, but you'll at least have more story bits to find. Silent Hill 2 has an exceptional story that's still worth your time, and whether you choose the original, remake, or both, you're in for a very good melancholy journey. The gameplay of the original Silent Hill 2, just like its predecessor, is all about the classical survival horror style of having limited number of items, stiff combat, puzzle solving, and tank controls. No! It's a near carbon copy of the first Silent Hill game, with nothing really new in terms of how James has to go around the game. Though thanks to the PS2 hardware, James does run a bit smoother than Harry. But also just like Harry, he runs out of breath. While item management has often been a long-standing mechanic for survival horror games, tank controls have also been the norm for the older generation survival horror, particularly that of Resident Evil and many of its derivatives. Now, while the control scheme itself may be dated, with barely any modern game using this style of gameplay, controlling James in Silent Hill 2 didn't feel bad at all. Moving around levels and working with the ever-moving camera system of Silent Hill 2 was very manageable. I wouldn't exactly call it the best, but I had no problems with it either, and I think it still works well for the design that Silent Hill goes for. One thing that I do like about it is how it does make the game feel a lot scarier when combined with the camera system. James moving into the foreground or having to run in an awkward direction when the camera is placed above his head gives the game its claustrophobic feeling that adds to the already tense atmosphere. I enjoyed it, but I wouldn't blame you if tank controls really aren't your thing. On the modern side, the remake forgoes the use of tank controls in favor of a third-person camera system with a much larger emphasis on combat. Similar to the original, James still has to swing his melee weapon pretty frequently in order to bring down enemies, but it's a little more dynamic this time around with the inclusion of a dodge button. It actually makes the combat of the remake feel more like a third-person action brawler, sort of similar to the modern God of War games, or something in the same vein. It feels quite action-y compared to the original, since you're constantly striking enemies and dodging their attacks at the same time, so it definitely feels a little more dynamic than just standing around and spamming the attack button. Personally, it does feel more fun to play, especially when you mix in shooting, which can actually help alleviate combating certain enemies. For example, shooting them in the leg at certain points actually forces them to the ground, setting you up for an easy melee kill combo. It's pretty fun, but the game does feel very easy and less scary when you've mastered dodging pretty much every enemy attack. And some enemies also make it feel like a very fun boxing game. Luckily, Just as the original, both games allow you to tweak the difficulty when it comes to the puzzles as well as the combat, so you can tailor your experience how you need to. I do think the remake is much more approachable for a modern audience in terms of combat gameplay, since I'm sure most players will give you a bombastic side-eye if you even mention tank controls. On the puzzle side, much like the first Silent Hill, the second game features a wide array of puzzles for you to solve, ranging from simple item fetching like a key to unlock a door, to using every single neuron in your galaxy brain to calculate tip. They're all fun and interesting, and solving them is essential to progress James's story. The remake features a similar puzzle system, but with an interesting twist. While some older puzzles make a reappearance in the remake, there's also an entirely new set mixed in, even replacing a few old ones. I'd say it's a good mix, and it keeps things fresh, especially for longtime fans who are familiar with the classic version. I do think the standard difficulty of the puzzles in the remake felt less cryptic than the ones of the original standard mode, so if you want something a little more brain-teasing, you might want to up the difficulty. There is one thing that does make the remake a little more meaningful to players who have played the original, and that is the various locations in certain levels that directly reference the original game, largely in the form of puzzles that you use to solve. It's a fun callback, and I'm sure newer players will be confused when they come across these references. Other than the main gameplay changes, there's a few changes to some of the bosses. Spoilers for anyone who doesn't want to see, so skip here if you need to. But I do think the changes to the bosses are much appreciated, especially when compared to the classic game. In the older title, all the bosses were basically enemies that you had to shoot until they died, and move out of the way when you needed to. You still have to shoot the bosses in the remake, but a lot of them are remixed for more interesting gameplay. The first Pyramid Head boss fight, for example, no longer takes place in the small room that it used to, but now it has an actual arena for you to fight him one-on-one. The Abstract Daddy boss fight now has a mixed chase section rather than the small room where all you really did was blast him with a shotgun. There's a few others with some notable changes, plus an interesting mini-boss that takes place in the hotel section, which I actually kind of liked, but I would say these were good necessary changes that the remake needed to do to complement the new gameplay. One thing that I will comment on is how the remake actually took roughly 7 more hours to complete than the roughly 8-hour completion time that I did on the original. This is largely due to how the levels and puzzle portions are extended. While they were fun to do, getting to each of them did feel like a bit of a chore, and there's a lot of time being spent going between each of the puzzles with combat mixed in between. I preferred the pace of the original because there was less downtime between the story's elements of the game, but I think if you're coming into Silent Hill on the remake alone, this shouldn't be a problem at all. Overall though, I enjoyed both the slow, tanky, and claustrophobic gameplay of the original, as well as the more action-oriented one of the remake, while both felt equally fun in terms of the puzzle aspect. On the presentation side, the classic game still has its, and I shudder to say this word for the PlayStation 2, retro aesthetics that still give the game its creepy atmosphere. While obviously not up to current standards, there is a bit of uniqueness when it comes to Silent Hill 2's aesthetics, particularly the mix of environmental, lighting, and monster detail. While old, it's the combination of all these elements that create the dark and creepy atmosphere that you can only really find in Silent Hill 2, and I very much enjoyed it in its entirety. On the remake side, it looks very good in just about every detail of the game. When you first enter the foggy town of Silent Hill, I was honestly taken back with how good Team Bloober was able to make a modern rendition of the town. Seeing all the buildings, and even being able to get into some of them, added a lot more character that the older game was only able to do in certain sections. Even the build-up to get to the town is also well done. The dark creepy hallways are also well designed, and despite the perspective only being behind James, the dark corridors of each location, including the other world, look absolutely terrifying. The ruined drapes and the rusty cages that align the other world really encapsulate what a modern rendition would look like. The character and monster details of the remake have also really good modern renditions. From the lying figures, the bubblehead nurses, and Pyramid Head himself all look gross, terrifying, and scary for the sake of the remake. But in terms of the overall aesthetic that the remake nailed down from the classic, the lighting is the star of the show. and the creeping darkness that is ever present throughout each level is the tone setter for the entire game. On the sound design of the classic, it does an amazing job with its choice of tracks in specific scenes of the game, adding tensions to combat scenarios, relaxing or kaleidoscopic sounds in conversations with other characters,
Is this your only special place?
or the industrial and upbeat noises when fighting bosses. The music fits perfectly into Silent Hill 2. The sound effects are also extremely well done, with the noises coming from each source complementing each other, such as the monsters that make certain levels overtly scary, classic radio noise to create tension when there are nearby monsters, or the emphasis on silence to make you very anxious. All sound well done in instilling the feeling of horror that the game represents. On the remake end, it's just as exceptional on its sound front for both music and sound effects. With the music, most of the iconic soundtracks that are played for specific scenes are reused and even enhanced for the modern sound system, particularly the main theme when you meet Angela, as well as the boss fight themes for all of the Pyramid Head encounters.
I believe you. It's just, I guess I really don't care.
If it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.
But why?
I'm looking for someone.
Most of the soundtracks for the common enemy encounters and the other bosses have actually changed to better fit the tone of the scene. Fighting the nurses in the hospital in the old game had an industrial upbeat soundtrack, while fighting the nurses in the remake actually puts a greater emphasis on silence. Despite being different from each other, both games have very distinct sound effects and music that really complement the atmosphere and tone of Silent Hill 2. The biggest difference in sound, though, is the voice direction between both games. In the classic version, the voice acting retains the same level of stiffness and unnaturalness that you can find from the first Silent Hill game.
I wish I knew.
But she said it in her letter.
What letter?
It's not bad by any means, but it starts to slowly approach the room levels of stiffness.
Oh, hi, Mark.
And it feels forced and lacks some character nuance. Now, I do side on the opinion that the weird voice acting is forced, and it's meant to add to the unnaturalness of the whole game, especially considering that Mary's voice sounds good, so I want to say that every voice was actually looked over by the team. I could be wrong though, since I'm not quite sure, but the stiff and awkward voices are definitely an iconic characteristic of Silent Hill 2, and honestly give everyone their unique and weird character, even James.
How can you sit there and eat pizza?
On the complete opposite spectrum, the voice casts of the remake all sound amazing. James has a much lower register this time around, and sounds a bit sadder and gloomier in his tone. Not quite depressing, but he's bordering on it.
Spent the whole day there. Just the two of us staring at the water.
Both him and the rest of the cast have much more believable intonations and nuances in their voice, particularly Angela and Maria.
I can show you if you want. Unless you have somewhere else to be.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you.
Eddie, though, sounds like a completely different character, and he comes off as scared and timid rather than his original obnoxious personality.
It wasn't me. I didn't do it.
Do what?
I didn't do anything. I swear.
Hey, who's there?
It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I didn't do it, I swear.
While I don't want to say the remake version sounds better, they do sound a bit more natural by comparison. In all honesty though, I like both casts, and how they try to represent the core characters, even if some do feel different. So, after playing both the original and remake pretty much back to back, Silent Hill 2 was an amazing melancholy adventure to go through. I think even without the remake, the original version of Silent Hill 2 would still hold up very well 23 years later. Granted, yes, there's a bit of datedness with some of the gameplay mechanics and the way it controls, but the atmosphere and the story of the game are what really let it shine after all this time. And by virtue of the classic title, the remake makes it even more compelling to play Silent Hill 2, and its near faithfulness to the original work, along with Team Bloober's own iteration, have made it more accessible on modern machines. While the gameplay and aesthetics have been updated for the current generation, James' story is still a tale worth hearing, and the remake makes it much more compelling to want to play. As for the original version, considering that the remake is now an easier game for a lot of people to access, I feel like it's more of a recommendation if you really want the classical experience. And I do recommend it, as I think it has its own uniqueness over the remake. But of course, it is a harder title to access, as it's tied to the older generation consoles, whereas the remake is available on Steam and PlayStation 5 for now. So where logistics of access are concerned, the remake is an easy recommendation. But both games are still amazing in their own right, and Silent Hill 2 is still an amazing experience worth going through. Well, that's gonna do it for today, guys. Thanks for stopping by. There will be more games to play and more videos coming soon, so please stay tuned if you'd like to see more. For now, I will see you all next time. Bye bye!